The dust-laden wind whipped across the prairie as Francine Davenport's bare feet pounded against the sun-baked earth, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The rope marks on her wrists were still raw, a painful reminder of the captivity she had just escaped. Behind her, the thundering hoofbeats grew louder, and Francine knew that he was gaining on her Silas Blackburn, the man who had purchased her from the slave traders who'd abducted her from her St. Louis home. A man who believed he owned her now. "You can't run forever, girl." The menacing voice carried across the open terrain as Francine forced her exhausted limbs to keep moving, her torn dress caught on a patch of scrub brush, causing her to stumble. As she frantically yanked the fabric free, tears of frustration blurred her vision. She had been running for what felt like hours, but the vast emptiness of the New Mexico Territory in 1875 offered little sanctuary. With no destination in mind and nothing but wilderness stretching in every direction, her flight was beginning to seem futile. The sound of approaching horses made her heart seize with terror, not just one rider, now several. She darted toward a small cluster of rocks, the only cover in sight, but her strength was failing. Her legs buckled beneath her just as a lasso sailed through the air, landing around her shoulders. "No," she screamed, clawing at the rope as it tightened. She would not go back. She would rather die here in the desert, but the man who had roped her wasn't Silas. This rider approached on a chestnut stallion, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. With expert precision, he loosened the rope and slid from his saddle in one fluid motion. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Francine scrambled backward, her gaze darting past him to scan the horizon. "He's coming," she gasped. "Please, you don't understand. He won't find you here," the stranger said firmly, offering his hand. "I promise you that." Francine stared at him, uncertainty warring with desperation. The sound of distant horses grew louder. "I don't have time to convince you, madam," the man said urgently. "But I give you my word, Blackburn and his men won't touch you again. Not while I'm breathing." The mention of Silas's name made her decision. Whoever this cowboy was, he couldn't be worse than the fate that pursued her. She placed her trembling hand in his. "Xavier Thornton," he said, helping her to her feet and guiding her toward his horse. "Folks call me Zav, and we need to move. Now." The urgency in his voice spurred Francine into action. Xavier swung her up onto his horse with surprising gentleness before mounting behind her. Without another word, he turned his stallion toward a line of rugged hills to the west and spurred the animal into a gallop. As they rode, Francine felt the solid warmth of Xavier's chest against her back, his arms securely around her as he handled the reins. Despite her exhaustion and fear, she felt something she hadn't expected, a flicker of hope. "Where are we going?" she managed to ask as the landscape blurred around them. "Somewhere safe," Xavier replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Somewhere Blackburn and his men won't think to look." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Xavier guided his horse into increasingly rough terrain, following what seemed to be invisible trails through the wilderness. Eventually, they entered a narrow canyon, its towering walls providing welcome shade from the relentless sun. "Not much farther," he assured her, feeling how she slumped against him in fatigue. The canyon opened into a small, hidden valley where a modest cabin nestled against the base of a cliff. A small corral held several horses and a stream trickled nearby, feeding a small garden plot. "This is your home?" Francine asked, taking in the isolated sanctuary. Xavier nodded as he dismounted and reached up to help her down. "For now, it belongs to a friend, but he's away for a spell. No one knows about this place except those he trusts." Francine's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. Xavier caught her easily, concern evident in his features as he steadied her. "You're hurt," he observed, noticing the rope burns on her wrists and the dried blood on her ankles from her desperate flight. "I'll be fine," she insisted, though her body betrayed her as she swayed on her feet. "Let's get you inside," Xavier said, supporting her weight as they moved toward the cabin. "You need food, water, and rest. Questions can wait until morning." The cabin's interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a bed tucked into one corner. Xavier lowered Francine onto a chair and busied himself lighting a lamp and stoking the banked embers in the fireplace. "I imagine you'd like to clean up," he said, fetching a basin and pouring water from a pitcher. "I'll check on the horses and bring in more water. Take your time." When the door closed behind him, Francine finally allowed herself to release the sob she'd been holding back. The events of the past week crashed over her abduction from her teaching position in St. Louis, the terrifying journey west in the back of a covered wagon, and finally being sold to Silas Blackburn like a piece of property. She had barely escaped when one of his men had become careless with her bindings. By the time Xavier returned, she had washed her face and hands and composed herself as best she could. He carried a bucket of fresh water and some clothing draped over his arm. "These belong to my friend's wife," he explained, setting the folded garments on the table. "They might be a bit large, but they're clean." "Thank you," Francine said softly, "for everything. I don't know why you helped me, but no need to thank me," Xavier interrupted gently. "Any decent man would have done the same." "You'd be surprised how few decent men I've encountered lately," she replied bitterly. Xavier's expression darkened. "Blackburn is known in these parts, not favorably. You know him, I know of him. That's enough." Xavier moved to the small kitchen area and began preparing a simple meal. "You should change. I'll fix us something to eat." Francine took the clothes and retreated behind a screen in the corner of the room. The simple cotton dress was indeed loose on her frame, but after days in her torn and filthy garments, it felt like the finest silk against her skin. When she emerged, Xavier had set the table with bowls of stew and chunks of bread. Steam rose from a pot of coffee on the stove. The domesticity of the scene struck her as strangely comforting after days of terror. "It's not fancy," Xavier apologized, "but it's hot. It looks wonderful," she assured him, taking a seat. They ate in companionable silence for a while, Francine trying not to devour the food too quickly despite her hunger. As her immediate needs were satisfied, questions began to crowd her mind again. "How did you know I was running from Blackburn?" she finally asked. Xavier set down his spoon, his expression somber. "I've been tracking him and his men for 3 days. I was actually on my way to his ranch when I saw you running across the flats." "Tracking him? Why?" A muscle twitched in Xavier's jaw. "He and his men raided a small settlement last week. Killed the men, took whatever they wanted, including people." "People like me," Francine whispered. "Yes, though you don't look like you're from around here." "I'm not. I was a school teacher in St. Louis. I was abducted on my way home from school." She swallowed hard. "They brought me west by wagon, kept me drugged most of the way. I only fully understood what was happening when they sold me to Blackburn yesterday." Xavier's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I'm sorry for what you've endured, miss. I just realized I don't know your name." "Francine," she supplied. "Francine Davenport, Miss Davenport," he acknowledged with a small nod. "I promise you Blackburn will face justice for what he's done, to you and to others. Are you a lawman?" she asked, noticing for the first time the star-shaped badge partially hidden beneath his vest. "U.S. Marshal," he confirmed. "Though out here that doesn't always count for much. The territory is vast and the law is spread thin." "Is that why you're alone? Shouldn't you have a posse or something?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You've been reading too many dime novels, Miss Davenport. Most of my work is done alone, quieter that way." Francine studied him more carefully now. Xavier Thornton didn't fit her mental image of a frontier lawman. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intelligent green eyes and a face that, while weathered by the elements, retained a certain gentleness. His manner was educated, his speech lacking the rough edges she'd come to expect from men in the territories. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked. 5 years, he replied. "Before that, I was an army scout. I know this country better than most." "And that's why Blackburn won't find us here," Xavier nodded. "This valley doesn't appear on any maps. The entrance is easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for, and Blackburn's men aren't known for their tracking skills. They rely on brute force, not cunning." The reassurance should have comforted her, but Francine couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. What happens now, to me I mean? When it's safe, I'll escort you to Santa Fe. The territorial governor is a friend. He'll arrange safe passage back to St. Louis if that's what you want." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. After days of being treated as less than human, to be spoken to with respect and consideration was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed, blinking back sudden tears. "You should rest now," Xavier said, rising from the table. "Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." Too exhausted to argue, Francine made her way to the bed in the corner. As she lay down, Xavier extinguished all but one lamp and settled into a chair near the hearth, his rifle propped within easy reach. "Marshal Thornton," she called softly. "Yes, Miss Davenport." "How did you know my name before I told you?" There was a long pause. "I didn't. But you said Blackburn and his men won't touch you again. How did you know they had already touched me?" In the dim light, she saw Xavier's expression harden. "I've seen Blackburn's work before," he said quietly. "Sleep now, you're safe here." Despite her lingering questions, exhaustion soon claimed her, and Francine drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. Dawn broke with gentle fingers of light creeping through the cabin's small windows. Francine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, scanning the room. Xavier was already awake, moving quietly about the cabin. He had built up the fire and was brewing coffee, his movements efficient and practiced. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her watching him. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," she admitted, smoothing her borrowed dress as she rose from the bed. "Thank you for giving me the bed. You didn't have to do that." "My mother raised me properly," he replied with a slight smile. "Coffee." Francine accepted the steaming cup gratefully, warming her hands around it. "What's the plan for today?" "I need to check if Blackburn's men are still searching the area," Xavier explained. "If they've moved on, we might be able to head toward Santa Fe tomorrow. If not, we'll need to stay put a while longer." The thought of remaining hidden in this isolated valley with a man she barely knew should have alarmed her, but strangely, Francine felt only relief. "How will you check without being seen?" "There's a lookout point above the canyon. It offers a clear view for miles around." He gestured toward the door. "I'll head out after breakfast. You'll be safe here, but keep the door barred while I'm gone." As they shared a simple meal of cornbread and dried venison, Francine found herself studying Xavier more carefully in the morning light. There was a quiet strength about him that she found reassuring, but also something else, a sadness that seemed to lurk behind his eyes. "Have you been a marshal long in this territory?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "5 years in this region," he replied. "Before that, I served in Arizona for a time. It must be a lonely life." Xavier looked up, seeming surprised by her observation. "It has its moments," he admitted, "but I've never been one for crowds." "Is that why you live out here? This doesn't seem like an official marshal's residence." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, it's not. As I mentioned, this place belongs to a friend. Jim too feathers. He's half Apache, half Welsh, if you can imagine such a combination. He taught me most of what I know about surviving out here." "And where is he now?" "Visiting his mother's people. He'll be gone for at least another month." Xavier drained his coffee cup. "I should get moving. The sooner I check the area, the sooner we'll know where we stand." After Xavier left, Francine busied herself tidying the cabin. The simple domestic tasks helped calm her nerves and gave her a sense of normalcy that had been lacking in her life for what felt like an eternity. As she worked, she found herself wondering about the man who had saved her. Xavier Thornton was unlike any man she had encountered before. There was a complexity to him that intrigued her, the juxtaposition of his gentle manner with the unmistakable competence of someone accustomed to violence when necessary. He wore his authority lightly but unmistakably, and despite her usual wariness around men in positions of power, Francine found herself trusting him instinctively. She was sweeping the cabin floor when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, hoofbeats approaching. Dropping the broom, she rushed to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Xavier's chestnut stallion, Unbarring the door, she stepped outside just as Xavier dismounted. One look at his grim expression told her the news wasn't good. "They're still searching," she guessed. Xavier nodded, leading his horse toward the small stable. "Blackburn has men combing every inch of the territory. They've split into groups, working in a grid pattern. It's more organized than I would have expected from his outfit. So we're trapped here." The thought of being confined, even in this peaceful valley, sent a flutter of panic through her chest. "For the next few days, at least," Xavier confirmed, removing his horse's saddle. "I'm sorry, Miss Davenport. I know you're eager to return to civilization." "Francine," she corrected gently. "After all you've done for me, I think you can use my first name." He paused, then nodded. "Francine, then, and I'm Xavier to my friends. Are we friends, Marshal Thornton?" she asked, a tentative smile playing at her lips. "I'd like to think so," he replied, his serious expression softening slightly. "At the very least, we're allies against a common enemy." As they walked back to the cabin together, Francine was acutely aware of his presence beside her, tall and solid, like a shield between her and the dangers that lurked beyond their hidden valley. "Did you see Blackburn himself?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "No, just his men, about a dozen of them, spread out across the flats." Xavier held the cabin door for her. "They won't find this place, and even if they somehow did, they'd have to come through the canyon one by one. It's defensible." The matter-of-fact way he discussed the possibility of armed confrontation sent a chill through her. Have you killed men before, Xavier?" He met her gaze steadily. "Yes, never by choice, always by necessity." The simple honesty of his answer touched her more deeply than any platitude could have. "I'm sorry, that's not something anyone should have to carry." "It's part of the job out here," he said, but she noticed how his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. Over the next 3 days, a strange domesticity developed between them. Xavier taught Francine about the small garden that supplied fresh vegetables, showed her how to repair fishing nets, and even demonstrated how to shoot the small revolver he insisted she keep with her whenever he was away checking on Blackburn's men. For her part, Francine brought order to the cabin, prepared meals from their limited supplies, and mended their clothing with neat, precise stitches. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence. It was during these quiet moments that Francine began to learn more about the man behind the marshal's badge. Xavier had grown up in Boston, the son of a judge who had instilled in him a deep respect for justice. He had come west after the war, seeking purpose in a country torn apart by conflict. "My father wanted me to follow him into law," Xavier told her as they sat by the fire on the third evening. "But after what I saw during the war, I couldn't stomach the idea of spending my days in a courtroom." "So you became a lawman instead," Francine observed. "Still upholding justice, just in a different way." "I suppose so," he acknowledged with a small smile, "though out here justice looks different than it does in Boston." "How so?" Xavier stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "In the city, justice is about laws and precedents. Out here, it's about people. Sometimes the letter of the law doesn't serve justice at all." "Is that why you're after Blackburn? Because the law hasn't stopped him?" "Partly." Xavier's voice took on a harder edge. "Blackburn has managed to stay just within the bounds of legality for years. He has friends in the territorial government, people willing to look the other way. But this time he's gone too far. Because of me, the abduction," Xavier turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, "because of you and because of the settlement he raided. 6 men dead, 4 women taken. You're the only one who's escaped so far." The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on Francine's shoulders. "The other women, are they still at his ranch?" "I believe so. Which is why I need to get back to my original mission once you're safely on your way to Santa Fe." "You're going after them alone," alarm colored her voice. "That's suicide." "I've sent word to the federal marshal in Santa Fe," Xavier assured her. "Reinforcements are coming. But I need to gather evidence first to confirm the women are there." "And then what? A full raid on Blackburn's ranch. That's the plan." Xavier's tone made it clear he didn't wish to discuss the details further. Francine studied his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar that ran along his temple, the determined set of his mouth. In just a few days, this man had come to mean something to her, something beyond gratitude for her rescue. The thought of him facing Blackburn and his men filled her with dread. "There must be another way," she said softly. Xavier turned to her, his expression gentle but resolute. "Some men only understand force, Francine. Blackburn is one of them." "I know that better than most," she replied, unconsciously rubbing her wrist where the rope marks were beginning to fade. "But that doesn't mean I want you to risk your life." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "It's my job," he said simply. "Is that all it is to you? Just duty?" "It started that way," he admitted. "But now it's personal." The intensity in his voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who had lived a life of action rather than words. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Xavier turned his hand palm up, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Francine," he began, his voice low and hesitant. Before he could continue, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the distant whinny of a horse that wasn't theirs. Xavier was on his feet in an instant, dousing the lamp and moving silently to the window. "Stay down," he whispered, peering through a gap in the curtains. Francine's heart pounded as she crouched by the fireplace, the moment of connection between them shattered by the intrusion of reality. "Is it them?" she whispered. Xavier didn't answer immediately, his attention focused on whatever he could see outside. Finally, he turned back to her. "One rider approaching from the south side of the valley, not the canyon entrance." "How is that possible? You said the canyon was the only way in." "It is, for anyone who doesn't know this place," Xavier replied grimly, checking his revolver. "Whoever this is, they know the back trail over the ridge." Fear clutched at Francine's heart. "Blackburn?" Xavier shook his head. "Too careful for Blackburn, and just one rider." He moved to the door, positioning himself to the side. "Stay back, away from the windows." Francine retreated to the corner, her hand finding the small revolver Xavier had given her. The weight of it was unfamiliar and frightening, but she gripped it tightly, determined not to be taken without a fight. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped just outside the cabin. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then came a soft, distinctive whistle, 3 notes rising, 2 falling. The tension seemed to drain from Xavier's body. He let out a breath and moved away from the door. "It's all right," he told Francine. "It's Jim, your friend." "The one who owns this place?" Xavier nodded, holstering his weapon and moving to unbar the door. He wasn't supposed to be back for weeks. Something must have happened. The man who entered the cabin was not what Francine had expected. Jim Two Feathers stood as tall as Xavier, with broad shoulders and a lean frame. His features reflected his mixed heritage, high cheekbones and deep-set dark eyes from his Apache mother, and a strong, straight nose from his Welsh father. His black hair was cut short, and he wore a combination of traditional and European clothing. "Xav," Jim greeted, clasping Xavier's arm in a gesture of friendship. "I see you've made yourself at home." His gaze moved past Xavier to where Francine stood, and one eyebrow raised in question. "Jim, this is Francine Davenport," Xavier introduced. "Miss Davenport, Jim Two Feathers, the rightful owner of this fine establishment." Jim inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Davenport, I'd say any friend of Xav's is welcome here, but I suspect there's more to the story." "Blackburn," Xavier said simply, and Jim's expression darkened. "I should have known that snake would be involved somehow," Jim muttered. "That's why I'm back early. Word reached the reservation that Blackburn's been causing trouble again." As Jim shed his trail gear and accepted the coffee Xavier poured for him, Francine observed the easy camaraderie between the two men. It was clear they had a history, a bond forged through shared experiences. Jim listened intently as Xavier explained the situation: Francine's abduction, her escape, and the ongoing search for her. The territorial lawman's face grew increasingly grim. "So the rumors were true," Jim said when Xavier finished. Blackburn's expanded from rustling to slaving. It appears so, Xavier confirmed, and he's got at least 3 other women at his ranch. Jim's dark eyes flicked to Francine. You're fortunate to have escaped, Miss Davenport. Blackburn is not known for his gentle treatment of those in his power. I know, Francine said quietly. I was there only a day, but I saw enough. What about Santa Fe? Jim asked, returning his attention to Xavier. Any word from Marshal Collins? Nothing yet. I sent a rider 3 days ago, should hear something soon. Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on the table. What did you learn at the reservation? Enough to concern me, Jim replied. Blackburn's been making deals with some of the less scrupulous traders. Weapons, mainly, but there's talk he's planning something bigger. Bigger how? The kind of bigger that involves taking land that isn't his, Jim said darkly. Including parts of the reservation, Xavier cursed under his breath. That would trigger a war. Exactly, and guess who would be blamed? Jim's voice was bitter. Not the white rancher, that's for certain. The implications sank in slowly for Francine. He's deliberately trying to provoke conflict with the native tribes, Jim nodded. It's an old tactic. Provoke an incident, wait for retaliation, then call for the army to protect the settlers. After the dust settles, the land mysteriously ends up in the hands of men like Blackburn. We can't let that happen, Xavier said firmly. No, we can't, Jim agreed, but first things first. Miss Davenport needs to be somewhere safe, and we need to rescue those other women before Blackburn realizes what we're planning. I was thinking of taking her to Santa Fe once Blackburn's men moved on, Xavier explained. Jim shook his head. Too risky now. Blackburn has eyes in Santa Fe. If he sees you escorting a woman who matches the description of his escaped property, he'll know you're involved. Then what do you suggest? Xavier asked, frustration evident in his voice. My mother's people, Jim replied. The reservation is the last place Blackburn would look, and she'd be safe there while we deal with him. Xavier considered this, then turned to Francine. It's your decision. The reservation would be safer but more isolated. Santa Fe would be more comfortable but potentially riskier. Francine took a deep breath, weighing her options. The thought of being even further from civilization was daunting, but the idea of safety, true safety, was tempting beyond measure. If I go to the reservation, she asked Jim, would I be welcome there? I don't want to impose. Jim's expression softened slightly. My mother's family would welcome any friend of mine, Miss Davenport, and any enemy of Blackburn's is certainly a friend. Then I'll go to the reservation, she decided, on one condition. Xavier raised an eyebrow. What condition? That you promise to be careful when you go after Blackburn, Francine said, her eyes fixed on Xavier's face. Both of you. A ghost of a smile touched Jim's lips as he glanced between Francine and Xavier. We're always careful, Miss Davenport, aren't we, Xav? Always, Xavier agreed, though the look he exchanged with Jim suggested otherwise. As the men discussed the logistics of their plan late into the night, Francine found herself watching Xavier, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke of justice. The gentle way he ensured she was included in the conversation, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. In just a few days, he had become more than just her rescuer. He had become someone she cared for deeply. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, she had found a connection she hadn't been looking for with a man whose life was defined by risk and duty. A man who would soon be riding into danger partly because of her. We should leave at first light, Jim was saying, bringing Francine back to the present. Take the North Trail, it's longer but less exposed. Xavier nodded in agreement. I'll need to circle back afterward, meet with Collins and his men if they've arrived, and if they haven't. Then I'll have to improvise, Xavier replied with a grim smile. Jim shook his head. Your improvisations are what worry me, my friend. As the men continued planning, Francine silently promised herself that whatever happened in the days ahead, she would find a way to ensure that Xavier Thornton survived to see justice done. He had saved her life. Now she was determined to protect his however she could. The journey to the Apache reservation began before dawn. Jim had suggested Francine dress in men's clothing for the trip, both for practicality and to avoid unwanted attention should they encounter anyone along the way. With her hair tucked under a hat and wearing Jim's spare shirt and trousers, she could pass for a young man at a distance. They traveled single file, Jim leading the way, Francine in the middle, and Xavier bringing up the rear. The path took them through rugged terrain up steep inclines, along narrow ridges, and through dense patches of pine forest. Despite the difficulty of the journey, Francine found herself appreciating the wild beauty of the landscape. Around midday, they stopped in a sheltered grove to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. As Jim moved ahead to scout the next section of trail, Xavier settled beside Francine on a fallen log. "How are you holding up?" he asked, passing her a canteen of water. "Better than I expected," she admitted, taking a grateful sip. "I've never ridden this far before, but I'm managing." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Xavier observed. "Not many people would have escaped Blackburn in the first place, let alone survived alone in the wilderness." "I didn't survive alone," Francine reminded him. "You found me." "I found a woman who had already saved herself," he countered. "Don't diminish that accomplishment." His praise warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for the compliment, but for everything. For believing me, for helping me without question." "Without question," Xavier repeated with a slight smile. "I've asked you plenty of questions." "Yes, but you never questioned whether I deserved help," Francine clarified. "You never asked what I might have done to end up in Blackburn's custody, or whether I was worth risking your life for." Xavier's expression grew serious. "No person deserves what Blackburn does to those in his power. And every life is worth risking mine, for that's the oath I took when I pinned on this badge." "Is that all it is? An oath?" The question slipped out before Francine could stop it. For a long moment, Xavier was silent, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "No," he finally said, his voice low. "Not anymore." Before either of them could say more, Jim returned, his expression all business. "We should move. There's a storm building to the west, and we need to reach the next shelter before it hits." As they mounted up and continued their journey, Francine found herself replaying Xavier's words in her mind. Not anymore. Such a simple phrase, yet it carried a weight of meaning that both thrilled and terrified her. Was it possible that in the midst of danger and uncertainty, something deeper was growing between them? The storm caught them an hour before dusk, turning the narrow trail into a treacherous ribbon of mud. Jim led them to a small cave set into the side of a cliff, where they took shelter as thunder rumbled overhead and rain lashed the landscape in blinding sheets. "We'll have to stay here for the night," Jim announced, shaking water from his hat. "The trail ahead crosses a wash that will be flooded by now." As they made camp in the confined space, Francine was acutely aware of Xavier's proximity. They worked together to build a small fire near the cave entrance, where the rising smoke could escape. The dance of the flames cast shifting shadows on the stone walls, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the howling storm outside. Jim took the first watch, positioning himself near the cave entrance with his rifle across his knees, leaving Xavier and Francine alone by the fire. "You should try to sleep," Xavier suggested, offering her his bedroll. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "I'm not sure I can sleep," Francine admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Blackburn's face." Xavier's expression darkened. "He can't hurt you now." "It's not just me I'm worried about," she confessed. "Those other women at the ranch, they're suffering what I barely escaped. And then there's you and Jim planning to confront Blackburn." "We know what we're doing, Francine," Xavier assured her, his voice gentle. "This isn't our first dangerous mission." "That doesn't make it any less dangerous," she countered. "Blackburn has dozens of men. Even with reinforcements from Santa Fe, you'll be outnumbered." Xavier was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Sometimes," he finally said, "being on the right side of a fight matters more than having the most guns." "Is that something they taught you at Marshal School?" Francine asked, unable to keep a hint of sarcasm from her voice. A smile touched Xavier's lips. No, that's something my father taught me. He used to say that evil might have numbers, but good has conviction, and in the end, conviction wins. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Xavier agreed, a shadow passing over his features. He died during the war. Not in battle, but trying to defend a freed slave family from a mob in Boston. I'm sorry, Francine said softly, understanding now some of the drive that pushed Xavier to risk himself for others. He died as he lived standing up for what was right. Xavier's voice was steady, but Francine could hear the underlying emotion. I try to honor his memory by doing the same. Without thinking, Francine reached out and placed her hand over his. He would be proud of you, Xavier. Xavier looked down at their joined hands, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp her fingers. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through Francine's body, a contrast to the chill air of the cave. When this is over, Xavier said quietly, when Blackburn is dealt with and those women are free. What will you do, Francine? Will you return to St. Louis? The question caught her off guard. In the chaos of escape and survival, she had given little thought to her future beyond immediate safety. I don't know, she admitted. There's nothing really waiting for me in St. Louis except my teaching position, and that's likely been filled by now. You could start fresh somewhere else, Xavier suggested. Santa Fe, perhaps. They're always in need of good teachers. Santa Fe, Francine repeated, considering the possibility. It would be quite a change from what I'm used to. The territory is changing, Xavier said. Growing, becoming more civilized. It needs people like you, educated, principled. And what about you? Francine asked, meeting his gaze directly. Where will you be when this is over? The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple words. Xavier's eyes held hers, and in their depths, Francine saw something that made her breath catch uncertainty, yes, but also hope. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. 5 years as a marshal takes a toll. I've been considering other possibilities. What kind of possibilities? Xavier's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the gentle touch belying the seriousness of his words. The territorial governor has offered me a position as his advisor on law enforcement. It would mean being based in Santa Fe, less time in the saddle, more time helping to shape how justice is administered across the territory. That sounds like important work, Francine observed, her heart beating faster at the implications. Work that would make a difference. It is, Xavier agreed. But until recently, I wasn't sure I was ready to hang up my guns, so to speak. And now, Francine hardly dared to breathe as she waited for his answer. Xavier's gaze never wavered from hers. Now I'm beginning to see that there might be more to life than chasing outlaws across the wilderness, that perhaps there are other kinds of purpose worth pursuing. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibility. Francine was acutely aware of Xavier's hand holding hers, of the way the firelight cast golden highlights in his brown hair, of how close they were sitting. Xav, Jim's voice broke the moment. Your turn on watch. Xavier released Francine's hand reluctantly and rose to his feet. Get some rest, he told her softly. We'll talk more when we reach the reservation. As Xavier moved to relieve Jim at the cave entrance, Francine wrapped herself in the bedroll, her mind whirling with the implications of their conversation. For the first time since her abduction, she allowed herself to think beyond survival to the possibility of a future in this wild territory, a future that might include Xavier Thornton. The storm passed during the night, leaving a landscape washed clean in the morning light. The trio set out at dawn, making good time on trails that were muddy but passable. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge that offered a view of the reservation in the valley below a collection of traditional dwellings alongside more permanent structures, nestled against a backdrop of red cliffs. My mother's people, Jim said with quiet pride, the Mescalero band of the Apache. As they descended toward the settlement, Francine felt a flutter of nervousness. Will they accept me? She asked. I'm an outsider. You come with me and Xav, Jim assured her. That means something here. And they have no love for Blackburn. His men have harassed their hunting parties and stolen their horses. They were met at the edge of the settlement by several men on horseback, who greeted Jim with obvious respect and Xavier with recognition. Jim spoke to them in a language Francine didn't understand, occasionally gesturing toward her. The men nodded, their expressions solemn. "They'll take us to my mother's sister," Jim explained as they rode into the settlement. "She's one of the elders. You'll stay with her while we're gone." Francine glanced at Xavier, who rode beside her. "How long will you be away?" "A few days, perhaps a week," he replied. "Depends on whether Marshal Collins and his men have arrived from Santa Fe." The thought of Xavier leaving so soon sent a pang through Francine's heart, but she understood the urgency. Every day that passed meant another day of suffering for the women held captive at Blackburn's ranch. Jim's aunt, Nayland, was a dignified woman with silver-streaked hair and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to look straight through Francine when they were introduced. Despite the language barrier, Nayland's kindness was evident in her actions, preparing a place for Francine in her dwelling, offering food and clean clothing, and treating the last of Francine's rope burns with a soothing salve. As evening approached, Xavier sought Francine out where she sat outside Nayland's dwelling, watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. "Jim wants to leave at first light," he said without preamble, settling beside her on the wooden bench. "Marshal Collins should have reached the meeting point by now," Francine nodded, trying to hide the fear that gripped her at the thought of him riding into danger. "I understand." Xavier seemed to sense her distress despite her attempt to conceal it. "I've done this before, Francine," he said gently. "Many times." "I know," she acknowledged, "but that doesn't make it any easier to watch you ride away." A long silence stretched between them, filled with words unsaid. Finally, Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew something that glinted in the fading light, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. "This belonged to my mother," he said, holding it out to her. "I've carried it with me since she passed, a reminder of home." "I'd like you to keep it while I'm gone." Francine stared at the locket, understanding the significance of such a gesture. "Xavier, I couldn't possibly, please," he interrupted. "I want you to have it, not just to keep safe, but—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "As a promise that I'll return." With trembling fingers, Francine accepted the locket, opening it to find a tiny daguerreotype inside a handsome couple, the woman bearing Xavier's same green eyes. "Your parents," Xavier nodded, "on their wedding day." The intimacy of the gift brought tears to Francine's eyes. "I'll keep it safe until you return," she promised, closing the locket and clutching it tightly. "Francine," Xavier began, his voice low and intense. "When this is over, when I come back, don't," she interrupted gently. "Don't make promises now, not when you're about to face such danger. Tell me when you return." Xavier studied her face in the deepening twilight, then nodded. "When I return, then." He reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "But know this, I have something worth coming back for now." Before Francine could respond, Xavier leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise more binding than any words. When he pulled away, his eyes held hers for a long moment before he rose and walked away without another word, leaving Francine breathless and clutching the locket like a lifeline. The next morning, Francine stood with Nayland and watched as Xavier and Jim rode out of the settlement, two figures gradually diminishing against the vast landscape. Only when they had disappeared from sight did she allow the tears to fall, Nayland's weathered hand a comforting presence on her shoulder. The days that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Despite the language barrier, Francine found ways to make herself useful in the community, helping with cooking, watching the children, and eventually beginning to teach some of the younger ones simple English words. Nayland seemed to approve of these efforts, and gradually, Francine felt herself being accepted. Each night, she would climb to a high point near the settlement and look out in the direction Xavier and Jim had gone, clutching the silver locket and offering silent prayers for their safety. As one day stretched into 3, then 5, her anxiety grew, though she tried to hide it from the others. On the 6th day, as Francine was helping Nayland prepare the evening meal, a commotion at the edge of the settlement drew their attention. A rider had arrived, not Xavier or Jim, but a young Apache man who had been serving as a scout. He spoke rapidly to the gathered men, his expression urgent. Francine watched anxiously as the news spread through the community, unable to understand what was happening but sensing it was important. Finally, one of the young women who had been learning English approached her. "Fighting," the girl Dolly explained haltingly. "At Blackburn Ranch, many guns." Fear clutched at Francine's heart. "Xavier, Jim, are they all right?" Dolly shook her head, indicating she didn't know. "Men go help," she added, pointing to where several warriors were already mounting horses, weapons in hand. Francine rushed toward them, desperation overriding caution. "Please," she begged the leader, a man named Keem who spoke some English. "Let me come with you," Keem frowned, shaking his head. "Too dangerous, women stay." "But I know Xavier," Francine insisted, "and Jim, I might be able to help." Keem considered her for a long moment, then said something to his companions in Apache. One of them dismounted, leading his horse toward Francine. "You ride with Tarak," Keem instructed. "You stay back when we reach fighting. Understand?" Francine nodded quickly, relief washing through her. "I understand." As they rode hard across the darkening landscape, Francine's mind filled with terrible possibilities. The silver locket seemed to burn against her skin where it hung beneath her clothing. She had promised to keep it safe until Xavier returned. Now she was bringing it back to him, praying it wasn't too late. The distant sound of gunfire reached them before they saw anything. Keem signaled for the group to slow, approaching more cautiously as they neared a ridge overlooking Blackburn's ranch. What Francine saw when they crested the ridge made her blood run cold. The main house was ablaze, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it, figures moved in the chaos, men on horseback, others on foot, the sporadic flash of gunfire illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying tableau. "Stay here," Keem ordered, positioning Francine and Tarak behind a large boulder. "We go help." As the Apache warriors descended toward the battle, Francine strained to make sense of the chaotic scene below. Who was winning? Was Xavier down there, perhaps wounded or worse? The thought was unbearable. Despite her promise to stay back, Francine found herself moving closer to the edge of the ridge, desperate for a better view. In the flickering light of the fire, she could now make out distinct groups. Blackburn's men were recognizable by their distinctive hats, while others wore the badges of federal marshals. A third group appeared to be women, huddled together near a cluster of outbuildings. The rescued captives, Francine realized with a surge of hope. That meant Xavier and Jim had succeeded, at least partially. Then she saw him, Xavier, engaged in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle with a larger man near the burning house. Even from a distance, Francine recognized the second man as Silas Blackburn himself. As she watched in horror, Blackburn knocked Xavier to the ground and drew a knife. Without conscious thought, Francine was running down the slope, Tarak's shout of warning fading behind her. The small revolver Xavier had given her was in her hand, though she scarcely remembered drawing it. All she knew was that she couldn't watch him die. The chaos of the battlefield enveloped her, the heat of the fire, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded. Francine moved through it all as if in a dream, focused solely on reaching Xavier before Blackburn's knife found its mark. She was close enough now to hear Blackburn's taunting voice. "You should have stayed out of my business, Marshal," he snarled, looming over Xavier. "Now you'll die like the others who tried to stand in my way." "Drop the knife, Blackburn," Francine shouted, raising the revolver with both hands to steady her aim. Both men turned toward her voice, surprise evident on their faces. Blackburn recovered first, his expression twisting into a sneer of recognition. "Well, if it ain't my runaway property," he said, shifting his grip on the knife. "Come back for more, have you?" I said. "Drop it," Francine repeated, trying to keep her voice steady despite her terror. "I won't ask again." Blackburn laughed, the sound chilling in its cruelty. "You won't shoot, girl. You don't have the crack of the revolver cut off his words." Francine had aimed for his shoulder, but her hands were shaking so badly that the bullet grazed his arm instead. It was enough, however, to make him stagger backward, giving Xavier the opening he needed. In one fluid motion, Xavier was on his feet, tackling Blackburn to the ground. The knife went flying as the two men grappled, rolling dangerously close to the burning building. "Francine, get back." Xavier shouted, struggling to subdue the larger man. Instead, Francine darted forward and retrieved Blackburn's fallen knife. "Xavier, catch," she called, sliding the weapon toward him across the dirt. Xavier's hand closed around the knife's handle just as Blackburn landed a powerful blow to his jaw. For a terrifying moment, Francine thought Xavier would lose consciousness, but he rallied, pressing the blade against Blackburn's throat. "It's over, Blackburn," Xavier gasped, blood trickling from his split lip. "Your men are dead or captured, the women are free, you've lost." Blackburn's eyes darted frantically between Xavier and Francine, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "You can't prove nothing," he growled. "I got friends in high places." "Not anymore," came Jim's voice as he approached, a shotgun trained on Blackburn. "The territorial governor himself signed your arrest warrant. Seems he didn't appreciate learning one of his biggest supporters was dealing in human lives." With Jim's help, Xavier secured Blackburn with ropes and handed him over to two federal marshals who had approached. Only then did he turn to Francine, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have been killed, so could you?" Francine replied, suddenly conscious of how close they had come to disaster. "I couldn't stay behind, not knowing if you were alive or dead." Xavier closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with such force that it knocked the breath from her lungs. "You impossible, reckless, brave woman," he murmured against her hair. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." Francine clung to him, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her cheek, the solid warmth of him proof that they had both survived. "I still have your mother's locket," she whispered. "I kept my promise." Xavier drew back just enough to look into her face, his eyes bright with an emotion that made her heart race. "And I intend to keep mine," he said, before lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that contained all the words they hadn't yet spoken: relief, passion, promise. When they finally broke apart, Jim was standing nearby, a bemused expression on his face despite his obvious exhaustion and the blood-stained bandage around his arm. "If you two are quite finished," he said dryly, "we have wounded to tend to and prisoners to transport." Xavier kept his arm around Francine's waist as they walked together toward the makeshift camp where the rescued women were being cared for. "You know," he said quietly, "I had planned a much more dignified reunion. Perhaps a dinner in Santa Fe, flowers, a proper courtship." Francine smiled up at him, feeling lightheaded with relief and something that felt remarkably like happiness. "We can still have all that," she assured him, "but I wouldn't trade this moment for anything." "No," Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Not even for a reunion that didn't involve gunfire, a burning building, and one of the territory's most dangerous criminals." "Not even for that," Francine confirmed. "This is our story, Xavier. It started with a rope and a chase across the wilderness. It seems fitting that it should continue with a little excitement." Xavier laughed, the sound a balm to her soul after the terror of the night. "Well, when you put it that way," he conceded, pressing a kiss to her temple, "but perhaps we could aim for a slightly less exciting conclusion." "What kind of conclusion did you have in mind?" Francine asked, her heart quickening at the look in his eyes. "One that involves that position in Santa Fe," Xavier replied, "and a school in need of a teacher. And perhaps, if I'm very fortunate, a certain brave, beautiful woman willing to build a life with a former marshal." Francine stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Are you proposing to me, Xavier Thornton, in the middle of a battlefield?" "I believe I am," he admitted, taking both her hands in his. "Though I had planned to wait for a more appropriate moment, but tonight has taught me that life is too uncertain, too precious to waste a single day." "Then yes," Francine said simply, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes, I will build that life with you." Xavier's smile was like the sunrise after the darkest night. "You should know," he warned, "that life with a lawman, even a former one, is never entirely peaceful." "I wouldn't expect it to be," Francine replied, slipping her hand into his as they resumed walking. But as long as we face the dangers together, I believe we can handle whatever comes our way. As they reached the camp, where the first light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the faces of survivors and rescuers alike, Francine felt the weight of the silver locket against her skin, no longer a burden of fear and waiting, but a symbol of the legacy they would build together. A legacy of courage, justice, and love that had begun with a desperate flight across the wilderness and a cowboy's promise of safety. 3 years later, Xavier Thornton stood on the porch of their home on the outskirts of Santa Fe, watching as a familiar figure made her way up the path. Francine's arms were filled with books, her face alight with the enthusiasm that still captivated him as much as it had on that fateful day when he had found her running across the desert. "Successful trip to the bookshop," he called, moving to help her with her burden. "Very," Francine confirmed, leaning up to kiss him as he relieved her of the stack. "The new shipment from Boston arrived. My students will be thrilled." Xavier smiled. Following her into the house, they had built together a spacious adobe structure that combined the practical aspects of territorial architecture with touches of Eastern refinement that reminded Francine of her former home. "How was your meeting with the governor?" Francine asked, moving to the kitchen to prepare tea. "Productive," Xavier replied, setting the books on a table in what had become Francine's study. "He's approved the new training program for territorial lawmen. Jim will head it up with support from the federal marshals." "That's wonderful news," Francine said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Jim must be pleased." "He is," Xavier confirmed, "though he claims I'm trying to turn him into a politician rather than a lawman." Francine laughed, the sound as musical to Xavier now as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "Jim would make an excellent politician if he could just learn to be a bit less direct. That's one way of putting it," Xavier agreed with a chuckle. As they settled in their favorite spot, a window seat overlooking the garden Francine had planted, Xavier's hand drifted to the silver locket that still hung around his wife's neck. The simple piece of jewelry had become a symbol of their journey together, a reminder of how close they had come to losing each other before their life together had even begun. "Any word from the women?" Francine asked, referring to the 3 they had rescued from Blackburn's ranch. Over the years, they had maintained correspondence with all of them as they rebuilt their lives. "A letter from Mary arrived yesterday," Xavier said. "She's getting married next spring. She's invited us to the wedding in Denver." "That's wonderful," Francine said softly. "After everything she endured, she deserves happiness." Xavier nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about how differently things could have turned out for her, for the others, for you." "But they didn't," Francine reminded him gently. "Because of you, because of Jim, because of all those who were willing to stand against evil." She placed her hand over his where it rested on the locket. "And because of love." Xavier smiled, drawing her closer against his side. "You know, when I told you that day that Blackburn wouldn't find you, I had no idea how much those words would change my life." "Mine too," Francine agreed. "Though I must admit, when a stranger ropes a fleeing woman, marriage isn't typically the expected outcome." "We've never been typical," Xavier pointed out, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No," Francine agreed, turning in his arms to face him, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson reminiscent of that evening at the Apache reservation when Xavier had entrusted her with his mother's locket and the promise of his return. The wilderness that had once been the backdrop for their desperate flight had become the foundation of their shared life, a life built on courage, justice, and a love that had begun with a chase across the desert and a cowboy's promise of safety. In the nursery upstairs, their infant daughter began to stir, her small cries drawing both parents' attention. As they rose together to tend to her, Xavier caught Francine's hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar yet never lost its meaning. "I love you," he said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," Francine replied, her eyes reflecting all the warmth and certainty of their shared future. "My hero, my husband, my home." Together, they climbed the stairs to their daughter's room, leaving behind the memories of danger and separation, embracing instead the life they had built, a life that had begun with a desperate chase across the New Mexico territory, and a promise made and kept against all odds.